Welcome to the Compact Podcast. Today we'll discuss Iran's attack on Israel, the publication of the CAS report, and the effort to shut down NatCon in Brussels. I'm joined by Sohrab Ahmari, Power and Geoff Shullenberger, and I'm Matthew Schmitz. Iran launched rocket attacks on Israel. Most of the rockets were intercepted. 2 children were killed by the attack. This came in response to an Israeli attack on an Iranian diplomatic building in Syria, where several members of the Quds Force and Iran's Revolutionary Guard were stationed. Sohrab, you're following it closely. What's your read of the situation with Iran and Israel, and how is it likely to escalate?
So it's a very, very dangerous situation. The Iranians quite openly saying that this is in retaliation for an Israeli strike on their diplomatic facility, at which several Iranian military officers who were apparently in that facility were killed. So it seemed to if you followed kind of Iranian regime and regime-connected media, that they felt that this was retaliation. It was a very clear case that they were going to retaliate for that, and that Iranians had been put in a position unlike previous attacks where they had, there was like a nuclear scientist had been killed inside Iran, clearly by sort of Israeli intelligence, but it wasn't so flagrant. In this case, because it was such a flagrant attack on their diplomatic facility, they felt they had to sort of respond. This is the kind of Iranian government's perspective. So they launched about 320 different kinds of missiles. I mean, it was drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles. As you said, Matthew, 99% of them were intercepted. They were intercepted by the Israelis, working in conjunction with the French, the British, and the Americans, and also with a small assist from the Jordanians. So, in terms of like actual damage, not much was done, but it was still for the Israelis also it's a shocking development, right? You have the first time ever, despite the countries being arch rivals or arch enemies since the Iranian revolution in 1979, for the first time ever, you have direct attacks from Iranian soil directly against Israel. So very, very serious situation. Obviously Saturday night, I was kind of like filled with anxiety as an Iranian, obviously. I mean, the thought of like what the Israeli response in turn, the sort of tit for tat might look like, was in terms of people in my homeland, of like the city that I was born, Tehran, etc., was horrifying. I was worried about what would happen to my many friends in Israel. Again, a kind of horrifying thought. But above all, I was worried as an American, in the sense that, I just think it'd be a dreadful prospect. And in this sense, I'm in accord with the overwhelming majority of Americans who are not prepared to return to the Middle East in a big way. And so the fear is that this would spark a direct regional war between Israel and the kind of US-led bloc in the Middle East on the one hand, and the Iranian-led so-called axis of resistance on the other. That would be a really awful outcome for America for all sorts of reasons. First of all, like, it would drag us back into the Middle East just a couple of years after we finally disengaged from these kind of post 9/11 wars that were completely fruitless, expensive. It would, distract us from the kind of domestic consolidation and reconstruction that voters of both parties have indicated they would prefer us to focus on. And insofar as, there's a big desire for for maintaining American preeminence on the world stage, I think there is also an emerging consensus that the real theater for that is the Pacific, in terms of geoeconomic importance and the Chinese challenge to America's access to the Pacific region. That's where the action is, and it is not in the Middle East anymore. So for all those reasons, I thought it was it's a dreadful prospect. So far, I mean, I think I have a piece in the New Statesman today kind of praising the Biden administration. I think it's just been put in a very unenviable position, partly by its own decisions, including really alienating Russia. Russia used to be a partner to the West in trying to contain Iran's nuclear ambitions. Obviously, the Russians themselves don't want to see another nuclear power in the world, for their own reasons. But then it's now so alienated that when President Biden convened world powers to try to discuss the emergency, of course, the Russians didn't show up to the meeting, nor did the Chinese. But also, I think further mistakes going back, like the invasion of Iraq, which massively empowered Iran in the region. But now in this kind of immediate context, I think that it seems to me that the Biden administration is trying to was prepared to create like a choreographed tit for tat. So like give the Iranians a chance to do their thing, but the Iranians had given ample warning about that they were going to do this. Now, the Biden administration denies that they knew like exactly what they were going to do or which things they were going to target, but nevertheless, they were prepared to give warning. And then the missiles, as the New York Times noticed, came in these kind of sequenced waves, which makes them easier to intercept. And then when it was all over, the Iranian consulate or the Iranian mission to the United Nations released a statement saying like, now with that, we consider the matter closed, barring further Israeli kind of re-escalation. And now, the thing that the Biden administration is trying to do, and basically every other Western power has come down in the same way, is to frame this as this was a win for Israel. Basically, all the missiles and drones were shut down out of the sky. No real major damage was done. No one was killed, and that this was a win for Israel, and now is time to de-escalate. And so that's where things stand. And I think it's a very difficult thing to do, but it's a very important thing to do, in part for Israel's own sake, because I think that, getting dragged into another Middle Eastern war would weaken the United States overall. And especially given the kind of politics of the Gaza war right now, I think it would really deepen Israel's own isolation, from much of the world, but also from, kind of important domestic constituencies in the United States that are already kind of on the verge of being fed up. So I see the Biden administration continuing to thread this needle. I saw the people who there's this kind of a meme online where it's like the nothing ever happens, bro, debate versus the people who think that big things and scary things are happening. I think this particular development raised the stakes in terms of, or gave a kind of few points to the nothing ever happens bro types. But overall, it's still nothing ever happens bro still. And as I say this now, we're recording this on Tuesday morning, 9:33 a.m. Eastern time. If in 48 hours the Middle East is engulfed in flames and there's a full-blown Iranian-Israeli war, then I will eat crow. But I don't. It seems like for now the Israelis understand that they're not going to like spark a regional war. They said they will respond in some form. That's the decision of the war cabinet. They will retaliate in some form, but that in a way that wouldn't spark a regional war, whatever that means. But clearly that just tells you that the Israelis are sensitive to American and Western concerns about not sparking a regional war.
So I'm going to focus less on the event itself than the responses to it. And what struck me was that you could see it being spun in every conceivable way after this barrage of rockets and drone attacks occurred and was largely deflected. That both, on the official side, sort of both Israel and Iran wanted to spin it as in terms of their official outlets, wanted to spin it as a victory, right? Iran showing this incredible show of force and thus reestablishing deterrence against attacks like Israel's attack on its embassy compound in Damascus. On the other hand, you had, Israel saying, we showed them that not only could we deflect all of these rockets and sustain only minimal damage, but we also had, allies who, showed themselves willing to defend us, including Jordan, right? A Sunni Arab ally. And so you had a sort of perfect, that that part of the sort of balance that was set up was that the event could be framed, as a victory for both sides, and so in that way it served, propagandistically a sort of mutual purpose. And so, I mean, there is something that seems very weirdly choreographed and almost fake about this. That there's also the question of America's role here, right? Is America, and that there are certain commentators who, over the past several months, have been repeatedly bringing up this idea that ultimately America is not only protecting Israel but is actually trying to protect Iran's interests. So without weighing in on this claim specifically, what's striking here is that there was kind of back channel communication between the United States and Iran. So there was kind of this weird way that America was, communicating with both of the major actors, and thus, in some sense, functioning as the choreographer of this whole strange dance. And beyond that, this brought me back to the piece I wrote called Baudrillard in Gaza, relatively soon after this war began, where I revisited Baudrillard's, infamous claim that the Gulf War has not taken place, which was partly focused on the way that war had become a kind of staged, media spectacle in the context of the first Gulf War. So clearly this was, just, and anyone I think would accept that this is an example of that, right? That this attack was done more for the purpose of being a media spectacle than it was done for any of what we would consider sort of traditional military purposes, right? But then the further aspect of it that's interesting is that it was almost calculatedly ambiguous and could be interpreted in a variety of different ways, right? I mean, it can be interpreted as proof that ultimately the sort of complicated deterrent arrangements that are set up in the Middle East to prevent any wider conflagration work, or it can be understood as meaning the opposite, right? That in fact they're extremely fragile and could break down at any point. And of course, it can be spun as sort of a powerful show of strength for Iran or for Israel and its allies. So it's kind of a strange, ambiguous event, and this is another crucial part of how Baudrillard understood the development of war, as part of this larger logic of simulation, where he referred to the confusion of the fact with its model, which allows each time for all possible interpretations, even the most contradictory. So part of the nature of this kind of, this absorption of war into the logic of simulation is this perfect ambiguity around events like this, that they're, part of their intrinsic nature is that they array around them this flurry of seemingly contradictory interpretations, and that this is simply part of how they function. So it seemed like just another illustration of how strange the logic of war has become, and that this ambiguity isn't accidental, but is in some strange sense kind of built into the operational function of a military action like this, right? It's that this is not a kind of that the interpretations are separate from the facts kind of issue. It's that the facts themselves are already embedded in this strange logic that generates this flurry of contradictory interpretations. So it was a very, very odd event in that it had this kind of catastrophic World War III escalatory quality, but then at the same time, it was immediately interpreted in such a bizarre array of different ways that it could sort of mean anything to anyone, and that this was immediately apparent and sort of inseparable from the unfolding of the event itself. So, I suppose the provocative Baudrillardian take would be something like, the threat of World War III and the apocalypse, is distracting us from the real apocalypse, which has already happened, right? Which is the apocalypse by which, any possibility of stable meaning has already been subverted and obliterated, through a kind of, quasi-nuclear explosion. So that would be the Baudrillardian take, right? The fear of World War III is a distraction from the fact that the Armageddon has already come, and we're living in in the ruins of stable meaning that have resulted from it.
In other news, England's National Health Service saw the publication of the Cass Report, a report commissioned from the pediatrician Hilary Cass. It called into question the medical justification for hormonal and surgical treatments of gender dysphoric youth. Nina discusses it on Compact in her article, The Trans Reckoning is Here. What's the fallout been in the UK, Nina?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So this is the final part of report, and it's had massive waves. The earlier report also had some consequences in terms of the NHS pulling back from puberty blockers. And obviously, one of the major differences between the UK and the US is the fact that we do have a national health service, which employs more than 1 million people, and is enormously ideologically powerful in the UK. And I think we've also seen, unlike Canada and the US, a great deal of pushback against some of what we might describe as gender ideology in the UK on behalf of many women, parents, and so on, which again is a kind of difference I tried to explore a while back in an article for Compact called Turf Island. So perhaps some people in America won't have heard of the Cass report, or it won't have been reported particularly much. But over here at the moment, it's a huge deal because of the national quality of our health service. So the report, which is very, very sober, very rational, as many of the interventions into this debate over the past 10 years have been, despite the kind of hysterical opposition and despite claims of hatred and so on. We're very used to this kind of political polarization. Nevertheless, recommends that we simply don't have enough information about these drugs. They are clearly very powerful puberty blockers being given to young people who are otherwise healthy. Maybe they have emotional distress, but it's not at all clear that there's any evidence that these drugs are in any way helpful for the specific thing they're trying to deal with, and that they may indeed have long-term negative health effects. We know that when young people take puberty blockers, they tend to go on in great numbers to transition. Again, it's not clear from the Cass report that any form of medical, surgical intervention has any positive effect whatsoever on the purported problem, which is something like gender dysphoria. We know this is the term that's used. We know that often it's gender non-conforming and autistic children, children who often come from very difficult backgrounds, who have all manner of other problems, are being kind of taken up in what looks to be like a kind of medical experiment. And let's be clear, human beings can't change sex. It is immoral to lie to children. There is a great deal of anger about this. I think many people who are perhaps on the fence are now realizing the disastrous nature of this. I don't know what we might call it, a sort of social and medical scandal, I think. And yeah, so the Cass report is a very, very big deal. It will force not only the NHS but many institutions that have been pushing these ideas in schools and universities, and all kinds of employers have taken up ideas from charities and NGOs such as Stonewall and Mermaids, which really have been misrepresenting the law, but also reality more broadly. So my hope, and I think the hope of many other people, is that we will see an absolute sea change and reversal, backtracking. Many public figures are now reverse ferreting, as we might say, pretending that they never supported this ideology. When in fact we have receipts, as they say. But we will see, I think, a lot of people pretending that they didn't know, pretending that many people weren't speaking out on this and often being punished for it. So optimistically, I think we will see an end to this kind of public provision of these dangerous drugs, and an end to this kind of ridiculous idea, which has been, taken up for some series of bizarre reasons. And in the article that came out today for Compact, I discuss try to discuss some of the deeper possible psychoanalytic, psychological reasons behind the specific content of gender ideology, particularly relating to questions of maturity and whether or not we have a kind of fear of puberty, how puberty is understood in the West, but also I think a kind of fear of sexual difference or a inability for our countries somehow to deal with certain kinds of givennesses, right? The fact that we will naturally become sexually mature, the fact that we are born male or female. And this is crashing up against this libertarian or extreme desire for a kind of freedom at any cost, which is a central feature of liberalism, and it's really hit the buffers here, I think. So I think it's looking good, and hopefully many more children will be protected from the excesses and the violence and the grotesque interventions that we've seen over the past decade or so.
Conservatives, one or two kind of cultural war cycles ago, took a great deal of pride in what they called American exceptionalism and complained about things like American jurists citing international legal decisions in their opinions, and more generally calls to conform American law and culture in any way with law and culture around the world. Now there's on this issue a certain notable reversal. Not just conservatives, but many mainstream liberals would like to see the U.S. converge with what appears to be a new, belated consensus that's emerging, that these treatments of minors are just disastrous. But the Biden administration remains very strongly behind surgical and hormonal treatment of transgender youth. It's continuing to push things like a child's taking on a new gender in school contexts, even promoting rules that would discourage schools from reporting these changes to parents. It's really full steam ahead here in the U.S. So on this issue, American exceptionalism is alive and well, and maybe there's not much reason to welcome it.
Yeah, just a really quick addendum. I mean, if something is true for humanity, it's true everywhere. I mean, if there's no such thing as trans children, there's no such thing as trans children in any country, right? Nobody can change sex. This is a human issue, not a nation issue.
In the new world, you don't have to believe in biology. Come on, Nina.
Well, I think I mean, there's been plenty written about this, but uh, I think Nina's mentioned this reporter Jennifer Billick, but I do think in America we have this strange convergence of certain commercial and profit-seeking interests in the sort of biotech industry, big pharma, et cetera, that are really given free rein here. And whenever I have British or European friends visiting, they're always noting that the big pharma can like advertise directly to consumers, which is unheard of in the rest of the world. But there is also just part of the exceptionalism is that we have these incredibly powerful profit-seeking entities which are constantly looking for new frontiers to expand into. And as David Moulton has written about for Compact, have for decades, and not only over this but over various different things, have found ways of kind of collaborating with activists and NGOs in creating these kind of new areas of demand for their new products. And so I think part of the exceptionalism is, in a way, the thing that conservatives have historically loved about America, right, which is its capitalist dynamism, the unrestrained free market, as it exists in particularly medicine, right, which in much of the rest of the world is far more regulated and centralized and controlled. Here it's just the endless cowboy frontier of innovation, right, which conservatives generally love. And it's why in a very practical sense, it's kind of hard to imagine if you don't have a somewhat nationalized and centralized healthcare system, which conservatives have always opposed. You can crack down on these things. I mean, sure, you can limit them by limiting access to certain drugs for under 18s, but once you get beyond that, isn't it just a matter of choice that needs to be respected because it's a matter of consumer choice? So I mean, I think interestingly the exceptionalism here is very tied to aspects of the exceptionalism that the conservatives have historically celebrated about America, right? And the other thing that is interesting here, and I mean, Nina very beautifully brings in this generally neglected kind of late essay by René Girard about anorexia, where he analyzes the phenomenon of anorexia, in the late 90s, at a time when it's really the sort of mimetic, craze among teenage girls in particular. And what he links this to is that the sort of the conditions for this extremely unhealthy spread of mimetic desire for an ultimately deeply destructive thing, or for nothing, right? I mean, the anorexia, ironically, is sort of the desire for nothing, or the desire not to desire something very fundamental, which is food. Similarly here, we have a desire to evade something absolutely necessary and inevitable, right? Which is sort of the course of sexual development. So again, there's a kind of attempt to detach from nature itself, right? Which is a sort of perverse sort of hypertrophy of the logic of human desire itself, right? Which is in Girard's account, a desire that detaches itself from simple natural sort of needs and becomes socially instilled through imitation. And so the point here is that this is a sort of consequence of the liberation of desire, right? That it's a sort of necessary consequence of this untethering of desire and this desire for freedom, right? And so it becomes a desire for freedom from nature itself, right? And the other ironic thing about it, which I think explains the ambiguity of these developments, right, where on one hand you have this kind of desire to escape the confines of gender, right, but then on the other hand you have this desire to, or this de facto embrace of the most stereotypical conceptions of gender, right? So like, if you don't like X, Y, or Z sort of signifiers of femininity, that means you're not really a woman or something like that, right? That this is like so the contradiction within this whole set of developments is that on one hand it's about freeing yourself from these stereotypes, but then immediately it seems to involve falling back into the crudest versions of them. So I think the Girardian framework explains that very efficiently, which is simply that when you try to escape the models that you inherit from the culture, because we are inherently mimetic or imitative, you're simply going to gravitate back to whatever models present themselves, right? So this move towards freedom is actually going to essentially enslave you or confine you within, in some ways, far more oppressive models, right? And that's an essential insight that goes back to Girard's first book, Deceit, Desire, in the novel, right, where you see basically his analysis of 19th century literature shows this pattern over and over again, that these figures who seem to embody some movement towards this modern ideal of freedom, of individuality, of escape from society's strictures, actually end up kind of enslaved to these far more oppressive strictures, right? And that they impose on themselves, right? And so, I mean, I think this Girardian model that Nina brings in is very powerful, and in a way the I don't think we discussed it, but this New York Magazine piece by Andrea Long Chu a few weeks ago or a month ago, is a perfect illustration of this logic, right? Where there is this idea that you can, freedom means a kind of complete separation of yourself from nature, right? And but of course the place that this leads is, in many ways does not seem free at all, but seems subjugated to the most bizarre and sort of oppressive stereotypes, right? So anyway, I think it's a very rich and it's both just selling Nina's piece of it. I think it's one of the most kind of efficient but all-encompassing kind of analyses of what this whole phenomenon actually amounts to that I've seen anywhere. So please do read it at compactmag.com.
I do want to weigh in on this very quickly, which is just to note Nina's grace in response to essentially the center establishment in Britain, and is now like, yeah, like that's right. It's bad to castrate kids. But like, at the time when Nina, and I should say like a kind of a small but feisty and influential and wise cohort of mainly kind of feminist women were making these arguments. Of course, they paid an enormous price for it, to varying degrees. And I saw Mary Harrington, who's a sort of comrade of Nina's on these battles, had a piece over at a different independent magazine besides Compact, in which she said essentially like, yeah, we're going to get you now. We're not going to forget what you said. But that has not been Nina's approach. It's been, as she is, it's been the kind of gracious approach of like, more like, I pity you, for
embrace your inner Mary Nina.
Yeah. Yes. That's all I have to say. It's really, it's a beautiful piece of writing, but it's just a tribute to Nina's kind of equanimity in the face of these very vicious attacks that she's faced over many years.
As we record, the National Conservatism Conference in Brussels is kicking off. There have been NatCons here in the US. There's also been a variety of NatCon meetings in different locations in Europe. This year, the NatCon International moved to Brussels, the belly of the beast. In the run-up to the meeting, the socialist mayor of Brussels worked to compel various, or let's say encourage various venues to cancel on the meeting. One venue did agree to host, but now there's a police presence there, and citing security concerns, the police have been restricting ingress and egress, really restricting access to the event. It's a little bit interesting because NatCon is very much at the center of these debates about freedom and tyranny, democracy and autocracy. Sohrab, I know you've been getting some live on the ground reports from various attendees. What's going on there?
Yeah, talk about proving the point of NatCon about the kind of Brussels mandarins as these kind of intolerant, censorious liberals or illiberal liberals. Because look, NatCon 1 in Brussels. NatCon is this series of conferences devoted to national conservatism, organized by the Israeli-American political theorist Yoram Hazony, and it has had iterations, in Britain, in the United States, and in Brussels. A couple of years ago, they did one in Brussels, which, by all accounts, went on without a hitch. This one was actually kind of more high profile than anything they'd previously mounted. Prime Minister Orban of Hungary was scheduled to deliver a kind of keynote interview address. Suella Braverman, senior Tory figure, was scheduled to speak. Of course, Nigel Farage, the Mr. Brexit himself, and many others. And I should say, a friend of Compact and personal friend of mine, Gladden Papin, who works for the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs. And so basically the local authorities in the city of Brussels began agitating to shut this down as soon as they got wind of it. So that initially it was scheduled to be at one venue, and the socialist mayor of Brussels and others associated with the local government put pressure on that venue to cancel the event, and so they did. And then they next went to Sofitel, which is the luxury hotel chain worldwide. And again, there was similar pressure put on Sofitel's parent company, and they also then canceled the event. And finally, they went to this venue called Claridge's, which is owned, actually, as it happens, by a Tunisian migrant. And he was happy to do it because he considers himself a free speech champion. And so it began today, this morning, and then at about midday, the Brussels police showed up and shut down the event. They said that they wouldn't enter initially. They put forward in front of NatCon's lawyers a document explaining what they were doing supposedly, or what the legal basis for the action was, and they only gave them 15 minutes to sign or not sign. And then they proceeded to barricade the entrance so that people couldn't come in. At the same time, they wouldn't let the people who were inside the building, like Gladden and others who were texting me, are stuck inside. The reason is, I think they're sensitive, as I understand it. Right now, they're sensitive about what it would look like if they were to haul out various conservative intellectuals and politicians. It would not look good. So there's right, as far as we know right now. I mean, again, it's 10 o'clock now in the morning on Tuesday. What it looks like is, some people are stuck inside and others can't get in. The official excuse is that this is a public disturbance, and apparently other police officers on the ground told the organizers that they are worried there's going to be a progressive or leftist counter protest or counter demonstration, and that they couldn't guarantee the free speech of the NatCon organizers against that. Therefore, they shut it down, which seems very, that seems dubious to me, given the fact that they tried to, they basically canceled, they put pressure on the earlier venues that had signed up to do this to cancel it. Was that done in light of knowledge of left-wing protests that were going to happen that far ahead? It seems pretty unlikely to me, but I guess we'll find out. But it's just a huge PR win for Yoram, for the NatCons, for Prime Minister Orban and others, because as I pointed out on Twitter, some kind of British left-wing journalist had said, this is a bad thing to do on the part of Brussels because it's right out of the Orban toolkit. This is out of the Orban playbook. And actually, just a week ago, there was an enormous, tens of thousands of people turned out for an opposition rally, an anti-Orban opposition rally at the heart of Budapest. And there was zero interference from the Hungarian state. That went on with no problem. So to say that this is out of the Orban playbook is a bit rich, because it's really just out of the Brussels playbook. Orban does not shut down kind of opposition assemblies in this way. There's, I asked various Hungarian friends, including ones who aren't necessarily friendly with the current government. I said, has Orban ever shut down a public meeting in this way? And they all said, no, he's never done this. So it's amazing to me that even when they condemn the illiberalism of the Brussels establishment, some progressives and centrists have to be like, we shouldn't do this because it's the kind of thing that Orban does, when Orban doesn't do anything of the kind. I mean, again, you can look up the photos. Thousands of people poured into the streets of Budapest. There was no clashes with security forces, no tear gas, anything like that. It went on perfectly fine. So Orban does not, in fact, do anything like this. Anyway, but of course, it's a coup for Orban and the kind of Eurosceptic various politicians who showed up and of course for Europe, because it really just proves their point about what the European Union is like.
Yeah, just to note, looking at the sort of latest news on this event, Eric Zemmour, the French thinker, writer, and politician, has apparently not been allowed in, so he can't give his talk. I mean, so as Sohrab said, neither people are neither being allowed out or allowed in, including the speakers. I think, yeah, this looks terribly, terribly bad and anti-democratic. I'd just like to note, in the past sort of week or so, we've also seen cancellations and suspensions and bannings of left-wing academics such as Jodie Dean and Nancy Fraser over their support for Palestine and criticism of their signing letters or their rhetoric around events in Israel and Palestine. And frankly, we should be opposed to all of these anti-democratic moves from the supposed left, from the supposed right. I think really what we're talking about here is a division between a kind of authoritarianism and a kind of totalitarianism, even of ideas, and a kind of ideological lockdown of the Brussels kind. And and we can see that across the spectrum in some ways, and a lot of it is always invoking this fear of the protesters who are going to turn up against the conference. I mean, of course, this sounds like a terrible excuse. It is an excuse. I've had this experience many times where people have cancelled events because of some purported fear of protesters of the event, rather than saying the event itself. But in a sense, it amounts to the same thing. And I think this political invocation of security and safety is something we should be extremely aware of, because it's a very powerful tool to use, and it's often used in place of the real motive.
So two things. We just published Hamilton Craig's latest column which is on NatCon, but it's specifically on the history of thinking about Europe as a supranational entity versus simply a collection of separate nation states. And it goes back 200 years to the Congress of Vienna, when interestingly you had a conservative supranational order imposed by, above all, Austrian diplomat Prince Clemens von Metternich, who was essentially a kind of master diplomat of the era, and who oversaw the creation of the post-Napoleonic European order and the relatively successful creation of a peaceful settlement among European polities for something like 100 years, with a few wars and revolutions thrown in. But one thing that's quite interesting here is that at this time, the nationalists were generally regarded as liberals, right? And Sohrab has written about this in the pages of Compact. That really in the 19th century, nationalism was a sort of liberal and progressive ideology much of the time, and it was the conservatives like Metternich who were invested in creating these kind of supranational structures that would create some kind of comity between competing interests. And so one thing that's quite interesting in light of this shutdown of NatCon, this attempted and seemingly it's unclear exactly how it will end, but seemingly successful shutdown of this event is that that going back to the 18 teens and 1820s, nationalists in Europe were heavily censored. They were heavily shut down, by the power of these conservative forces, right? Because they were seen as subversive and disruptive. So it is interesting to see history repeating itself. You can read Hamilton's essay in which he goes into that history of the early nationalist forces in Europe being censored, shut down, nationalist professors being fired from their jobs, organizations being broken up, and so on. So interestingly, though, at that time it was the nationalists seen as the liberals, and the supranationalists seen as the conservatives. So anyway, an interesting historical backdrop to this. A second point is, for something I'm writing, I've been looking into the history of Antifa. And one thing that seems notable here is I dug into Mark Bray's book, which is the only history of Antifa as an organization. Bray is a sympathizer and presents his book essentially as a brief for the validity of Antifa's ideology and tactics. And he doesn't attempt to disguise that at all. It's a very partisan book. But one thing that's sort of ironic is Antifa becomes it's largely a kind of fringe phenomenon, right? It's essentially these kind of Antifa gangs fighting with fascist gangs in the context of like football and punk music and things like that. It's really quite fringe. It's essentially the a kind of West Side Story street gang kind of situation. But then it's really in the late 2010s that it kind of explodes into the public consciousness in the US and elsewhere because there's the rise of figures like Trump, of the Brexit movement in the UK, which are defined as being fascist, right, by many on the left. And so, one thing that's notable here is that, and Brace sort of touches on this in this book without really resolving it, is that, all of these tactics have really been developed to deal with relatively small and marginal organizations, right? If you have like a small white supremacist organization, you use these kind of sleuthing methods that Antifa pursues to figure out, where they're having their secret meetings. Then you show up and like beat a few of them up, create a public disturbance, and then the police come and break the whole meeting up, right? And this is their tried and true approach, right? They will do this of deliberately creating a public disturbance so that events are broken up. And this is kind of their explicit playbook. And so, one thing that Bray notes and quotes many Antifa leaders noting is, when you have figures like, or when you have entities like Marine Le Pen's national rally in France, when you have, organizations as big and growing, or say, Giorgia Meloni in Italy, that are defined as fascist, like the Antifa tactics seem like they don't really work anymore, right? You can't really use them to bust up a Trump rally or something like that to the same extent, because they're really best pursued in the context of relatively small and marginal gatherings. But one thing that's kind of interesting in this Brussels context is it might actually work if you have local authorities that are essentially aligned with you, right? As seems to be the case here, where the threat of a kind of violent disruption of the event, which is the standard Antifa practice. You go create a violent disruption, then the police have to come and break up the whole event, and you prevent it from happening that way. Like here, you see a sort of top-down application of that methodology, of that set of tactics, being embraced by the local authorities in Brussels. So it is interesting that you have this kind of illiberalism, and Antifa is openly illiberal, right? It openly rejects sort of liberal ideas about free speech and freedom of assembly. That is being embraced by figures who exercise power at the local level here, and seemingly, I don't know, and it's, I wonder to the extent to which there was some kind of coordination between the Brussels authorities and activist groups that might have been planning these, disruptive actions. I'm not sure, but it is interesting to see how this approach is being embraced at the higher levels of government, because otherwise, this kind of tactic wouldn't necessarily be effective against an event this kind of large. So anyway, that's an interesting note to all of this, I think.
Well, with that, thanks to Sohrab, Geoff, and Nina. Again, go to compactmag.com. There you can read Nina's article, The Trans Reckoning is Here, and you can subscribe at compactmag.com/subscribe.